Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Vulture's Rainbow Theatre. This is your host, Damon Vulture, welcoming you back as we continue with Chapter 6 of Michael Terlou's weird Western novella, The Guns of Sotol Flats. And now, Chapter 6, Padre Junipero. What a calamity, thought the priest as he finished sweeping up fragments of the statue of Santo Aguatino. One of the bandidos had backed into it, knocking it off its perch on the well, as he had held them under gunpoint, shouting his orders. The priest's servants had complied, bringing out into the stone-walled courtyard of the church every bottle of wine, every sealed crock of vegetables and preserves from the garden, every burlap bag of beans and rice they could find. The bandidos had seized the church's wagon, hitching up the parish horses that did not belong to them and loading it with the stolen goods. Father Junipero had followed them to the church gate when they left, watching the wagon careen swiftly down the street, with two shouting oafs now in charge of it. They had hollered and yipped at their comrades as they drove by, inviting the other men who were robbing businesses and homes up and down the street to throw their loot into the wagon bed. He had seen a couple of bodies in the street, both of them armed vaqueros who had attempted some kind of defense of the town, both of them rewarded with death for their trouble. Señora Corazon Moreno, one of the ladies who cared for the altars of the seven saints, had gone to her knees behind him in the courtyard as he had stared out at the mayhem, listening to the shouted commands of the desperados, the pleas of storekeepers, and the occasional gunshot on other streets. He remembered now that she'd started praying, repeating rote prayers at a speed which had caused him to marvel, even in the midst of the locura which then possessed the streets of Villarreal del Rio. Now it was over. Like everyone else in town, he was sweeping up the mess, righting the tipped furniture, putting things back as best he could. The town had lost a lot of property through theft and damage, but the bandidos had not taken many lives. A few of the town's young men, in fact, had been encouraged to join with them, to follow them back over the river into Tolixco. For Padre Junipero, the apparent restraint of the raiders was cause for gratitude to God. He had uttered many prayers of thanks to him and to his saints, the seven fingers of his divine hand. That evening, the Mass he offered for the villagers would express thanks, with prayers also for the bandidos themselves, that their cause in Tolixco would soon find success, thus making their raids into the Republic unnecessary. He had just put his broom down to take a little breather when he heard the clop of hooves just outside the gate. He looked up just in time to see Billy Ryder and Eduardo Gonzales, two men who once served as altar boys in that church, whom Padre Junipero himself had instructed in the faith, who had first tasted the wine of union from a cup held in his own hands. "Hola, Padrecito," called out the one he remembered as a slight, shy, brown-skinned boy who was often the victim of bullies in the barrio around the church. What did they call him now? The shark? El tiburon? Now, with his quick wit and swift gun, he was a respected man. Billy, on the other hand, had always been a strong, smiling lad with flashing white teeth and a kind of rough-hewn charm. Today, however, His face appeared as gray as the clouds rolling in north from across the river. He looked as if he were grieving and furious at the same time. ¡Ay, mis hijos!, he exclaimed. ¿Y cuántos años han pasado desde que nos hemos visto? How long has it been since we last saw each other? Billy said nothing, did not even look up, but Eduardo smiled. It was at the wedding of my sister Carolina, he replied, when she married that molinero from Puente de Piedra 4 years ago. As Eduardo said this, he and his partner dismounted to stand before the priest. Oh, yes, said the priest, carrying on the small talk a little longer, though he could see there were more serious matters the men wished to address. As I recall, you and he got into some kind of drinking contest at the baile which followed after sundown. Carolina has never forgiven me, said Eduardo. After that man got a few drinks in him, he said the most outrageous things. She swore never to kiss the lips from which such filth could spew, but in the end she forgave him. I was not so fortunate. The padre smiled, patting his shoulder, and moved on to the one who stood there next to him, clearly wounded in spirit. He took Billy's hand into both of his. And you, my son, I see great trouble in your face, great grief. Billy looked up at him then. What the padre saw made him flinch. Billy gripped the priest's shoulder firmly for a moment, then walked away toward the sanctuary, removing his hat as he neared its ornate double wooden doors. Once inside the church, Billy closed the portals back behind him, then turned to look up first at the high black beams of the pitched ceiling. The walls of white-painted adobe, covering the thick stone of the church building, kept outside noises at bay. The place was so quiet he could hear the hiss and beat of blood in his ears. Down at the end of the aisle which ran between the wooden pews, hanging on the wall over the altar, was the great hand of 7 fingers, each finger a different color, each finger graced with a ring, each ring bearing a sigil of one of the 7 saints. On the altar, covered at this time of year with green silk, stood the cup of union, a wooden lid covered with green silk on top of it. Not forgetting to dip holy water from the font by the door, and not forgetting to touch his forehead, lips, and heart with it, he proceeded forward down the aisle. When he reached the altar, he bowed to his God's 7-fingered hand, then opened up a kneeler in one of the pews. Once on his knees, he discovered that no prayer would come to him. First, there was the fury tearing through him like wildfire, the consuming desire to close with the men who had raided the farm and kill every one of them. But even more than that, he was heartsick and in a rage about Sequoia. In his mind's eye, images of the young woman he loved with her beautiful red hair and green eyes alternated with the picture from that damned card of Don José's. It was clear to him that the dead man's prophecy had come true. She had suffered and then died a horrible death. On the way to the church, he'd had an idea of praying for guidance, of asking for help, but now the words would not come. In fact, after all the prayers he had uttered for years beneath the stars of the desert for her safety and their future together, to have it all turn out like this was an outrage. It seemed clear to Billy that if a man's love could be taken from him suddenly with such horrific violence, why, God was just playing with him, permitting fortune to torture and eviscerate him as a cat would do with a mouse. He wouldn't have it, he told himself. He would find El Calvo and his men, and he would kill every single one of them. That kind of a vow was not something you made up in a church. He got up then, abruptly kicking the kneeler back into its place under the pew. He cast his eyes then toward one of the 7 chapels which opened up onto the main sanctuary, to the chapel of San Roberto Fierro. The priest had long ago taught him the story of that saint, of how in ancient times he'd been a village blacksmith back on the continent, a man who had been martyred in the service of God in the days before the Imperio had accepted the faith. Back then he was called San Martillo. But as Padre Junipero said, though the saints are changeless and eternal, the men or women whose names they take may change from time to time. For that reason, the story of this saint now was told not of ancient San Martillo, but of the much more recent San Roberto Fierro, a gunsmith in the service of the first president of Tolixco, Victorio Flores de Castolón. This Roberto Fierro had given his life for the faith and for his country during the Tolixcan War of Independence. Now it was his face which appeared in every chapel dedicated to the saint of ironwork and weapons along the border. San Roberto had his own chapel and his own altar, like the 6 other saints who were the fingers of God's hand. The walls of his holy place were painted with a rust-tinted ochre, and on the orange altar cloth stood the black iron statue of the martyred saint himself, wearing an apron, grasping in his hand a hammer, a burly, bearded saint on whose broad face could be seen simultaneously the expression of joy in work, of confidence and strength, of might and justice. Billy did not kneel at the low barrier separating worshippers from the altar, but simply stood, letting his eyes range back and forth along the shelves set into the wall behind San Roberto's statue. These shelves, jutting out only a few inches, but ranging the length of the chapel's rear wall, bore rows of bullets set upon their ends, standing like soldiers on parade, each bullet etched with the initials of the man who had left it there, so that his gun would be blessed. Somewhere in the ranks of these projectiles, a bullet from Billy's 6-shooter stood, where he had had Padre Junipero place it years ago when he had first become a man, when at his coming-of-age ceremony he had offered his gun to the service of God's hand, and had sworn the oaths of restraint, of mercy, of protection for the innocent. There was no room on that shelf for the bullet of a gun to be used in vengeance, nor did he see in his future any occasion for restraint or for mercy. At last his eye lighted upon the WR scrawled upon a bullet in one of the many shelves behind San Roberto. Lifting his legs one at a time over the altar rail, he entered the holy place itself, took the bullet between 2 fingers, and stuck it in his pocket. He liked to think that San Roberto had guided his hand on all those successful hunts for outlaws throughout the territory of Navaja. He didn't think San Roberto would be interested in helping him now, not with the project he had in mind. He was just swinging a leg back over the rail into the main sanctuary when the padre entered, Eduardo with him. It was a sacrilege for a man to go into the holy places as Billy had just done, and Father Junipero had just come face to face with his former altar boy when he realized what had taken place. "My son," he said, his voice tremulous with disapproval, "it is not done to enter the holy places. Explain this thing to me." He was standing in front of Billy at this point, eye to eye, firmly grasping the man's elbow, even as he scolded him. Billy returned his gaze, unrepentant. "They killed Sequoia and her daddy," he said to the priest, his voice rasping and hateful. "For what I'm about to do, there ain't gonna be no blessing from God or the 7. The priest blenched, stepping back from Ryder, who trembled in his slow-burning rage. Padre Junipero was about to shout at Billy, to remind him of the path to paradise, but there was something in the bounty hunter's steel blue eyes which told him that the man had no ears to hear just now, at least not from him. Maybe he thought Eduardo would say something, would remind Billy of the oath he had sworn to the hand at his coming of age. But Eduardo, who was looking not at him but at Billy, had a strange expression on his face, a look almost both of triumph and amusement, a look which said, "Ya te dije, I told you so." "You are good with a gun, mi amigo," Eduardo said to Billy, "but I know someone who can make you better." Billy was surprised. Before now, Eduardo would never have uttered those words to him. The priest knew it too. But surely Eduardo did not mean that. It was then that Padre Junipero noticed the pouch hanging from a leather strap around the Tolixcan's neck. He could see that Billy was lost, at least for now, to the faith. Now he realized that Eduardo was too, permanently in his case, and had been for a long time. "Eduardo," he said softly, eyeing the pouch which he knew carried blood-encrusted bullets within. "You have brought the profane into God's house. Both of you must leave." That was fine with Eduardo. He stayed away from churches these days. He'd come because Billy had led them there. It was also fine with Billy. Billy'd come, he realized, not to pray, but only to claim the bullet back from its place of dedication. "Sorry, Padre," Billy said to Father Junipero. "Let's just call this goodbye." You have been listening to Vulture's Rainbow Theatre. This is your host, Damon Vulture, wishing you good night and dark dreams.